Welcome, everybody. We're excited to be here and honored to be spending time with you this afternoon. Carrie's going to get us started.
Yeah, so like was already stated, our talk is called Imagining Inclusive Classrooms with Sexual and Diverse Students. And this is just a little overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start out with some definitions and just a little overview of the most recent research regarding sexual and gender diverse students. We'll also talk a little bit about school climate and why it matters to all students, including our LGBTQ plus students. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about things that we can do in the classroom and hopefully also give a little brief overview of what the work that we've been doing for TOPS. So I'm going to go over some important definitions regarding sexual and gender diversity. And these are youth or individuals who are sexually diverse or gender diverse, and they're often referred to as members of the LGBTQ plus community. This term can vary, and typically it's kind of shortened to LGBTQ plus because it's just easier, a little bit easier to say. But at the same time, there's a little bit of debate about what term is most inclusive or most effective. And so that's just to say for today, we'll be using LGBTQ plus. So we just wanted to go over some definitions really quickly. Sexual orientation is usually defined by the pattern of who we are sexually, emotionally, and romantically attracted to. The definitions provided here provide a good overview of sexual orientations that exist, but may not encompass every orientation that a child or adult might identify with. So when thinking about definitions related to sexual orientation and gender identity, it's important to remember that someone's sexual orientation isn't dictated by their gender identity or vice versa. So being transgender doesn't mean that someone is inherently gay, and also someone being gay or a lesbian doesn't mean that they're inherently cisgender. So that's just an important note, just to remember that these are two separate identities. So terms like lesbian and gay might be more familiar to most of us. A person who is gay is a person who is attracted to individuals of the same gender. Other terms like bisexual and pansexual may feel familiar to many of us, but I also wanted to include them here today because there have been some recent kind of changes in thinking about the language around bisexual and pansexual identity. So bisexual, for instance, many people hear that term and they assume that it means someone who is attracted to men and women. And I think traditionally that's a fair assumption. However, it's more accurate to define bisexual as someone who is simply attracted to more than one gender. And bisexual people in general have really tried to emphasize this, in part to kind of make sure that they're not excluding transgender people from bisexual identity or as being part of bisexual attraction. And pansexual just means that someone who is attracted to all genders. And these terms can be used interchangeably, but bisexual and pansexual people also have different feelings about whether or not they should be used interchangeably. I wanted to include asexual people in our definition. So these are people who experience little or no sexual attraction to anyone. They might feel romantic attraction, they might feel emotional attraction, but they don't feel sexual attraction. And I will say that asexual people don't always feel part of the LGBTQ plus community, but I did want to include them because there are definitely students who may identify as asexual. And finally, many young people really like the idea of referring to themselves generally as queer. And I think older generations too are kind of leaning towards this term more. Queer used to be a pejorative and it's kind of been taken back by the LGBTQ plus community. And a person who identifies as queer is just a person whose gender identity or sexual orientation kind of falls outside typical heterosexual or cisgender boundaries. And so again, I think a lot of people really gravitate towards this term because it just gives you a lot of freedom. So gender identity and some of the terms associated with gender identity. Gender identity is our internal experience and naming of our gender. So gender identity is a person's psychological sense of being male or being female or being non-binary. And although one's gender identity is not a choice, the way someone describes their gender throughout their lifetime may change due to societal restrictions around gender, the evolution of the language, just talked about how some of the language has been changing. I think it will continue to change. Or just simply as a result of the fact that their gender identity isn't static. It may have simply changed and now they use a different label. Many people are cisgender. They feel that the sex they were assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity. However, there are many people that do not feel that way, and this encompasses a number of identities and expressions related to gender. I really think that this is exemplified just by talking about the existence of the gender spectrum. Gender is often talked about in binary terms, but really it's more accurate to think about gender as existing on a spectrum or a continuum, which imagines gender kind of stretching from one end to another, from men to women, from masculine to feminine, or even from non-gendered to gendered, or from agender to masculine or feminine. So transgender individuals are anyone whose gender identity differs from their assigned sex at birth. And it is kind of worth saying that assigning sex at birth is typically done quite quickly. It's typically done from simple visual identification. And so there's just a lot of complexities that come with that. And a trans individual may have been assigned female at birth, but is a man. They may also be assigned female at birth and then identify as non-binary and trans. A non-binary person is someone who doesn't identify as either a man or a woman. And some individuals feel that their gender identity is not static. Their gender changes or they move between multiple gender identities. Such individuals may refer to themselves as gender fluid. And I also think it's worth noting when you're talking about non-binary and gender fluid people, and even transgender people, that they may have a gender identity, but that doesn't dictate what their gender expression looks like. So it doesn't dictate the clothes that they wear on an everyday basis. It doesn't dictate how they think of their identity. So that's just worth noting. And then finally, I also included two-spirit. Western culture defines gender on a binary. You are either a man or a woman, again, despite that scientific evidence regarding the gender spectrum. And the presence of third genders in different cultures around the world and throughout history is well documented. And so two-spirit people are neither female or male, and they have a distinct alternative gender in indigenous communities. They have distinct roles and they do jobs or are viewed in a manner that is not aligned with one gender. We wanted to include this slide from Demi Lovato. Demi Lovato, if you don't know, is a quite famous pop star who came out as non-binary and was recently misgendered by a journalist. So Demi uses they, them pronouns. And then they put up this great sort of note on their Instagram. And we just wanted to highlight that we're all kind of learning here. That includes both of us, and things are changing a lot and it can feel overwhelming, but at the same time, if you're willing to try, if you're willing to make mistakes, it will really matter to LGBTQ+ individuals. And then finally, really briefly, I just want to talk about what does the research say? Cultural beliefs and values are always going to interact with and sometimes clash with scientific research. However, it can be important to kind of focus on or note what the science actually says about gender identity. and sexual orientation, and how that may differ from cultural beliefs or values. There's a lot of people that identify as LGBT. 18 million adults identify as LGBT. And you'll also notice that I'm just using the term LGBT. We still need a lot of research to help us understand how many people really fall under that bigger umbrella. And we also know that about 2 million children identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. There was a very, very large study that confirms that sexual orientation is not a choice. However, it is also not simply the result of one gay gene. A study, which was the largest genetic investigation of sexuality ever, found that sexual orientation reflects a number of biological, physiological, and experiential factors. Genetics explain about 25% of sexual orientation. Gender development in children has been studied relentlessly for a number of years. We know that toddlers can identify and define gender. We also know that children can typically define their gender by the age of 3. And then finally, this really, really interesting study by Golgoz et al. In 2019 spent 4 years collecting information about the gender development of trans children who are ages 3 to 12. And the study found that gender development among transgender children mirrors cisgender children, and the strength of their gender identity is indistinguishable from cisgender children's. The strength of their gender identity was also not changed by how long they had been treated as a gender that they didn't identify with.
We wanted to also mention, for those of you that are thinking about where to talk about these issues, the last slide that Carrie presented could be an example of child development, adolescent development, and then this could be potentially used in a historical perspective, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. When we take a look at where sexual orientation and gender diversity fall, you can follow this on a timeline. From 1952, homosexuality was included as a sociopathic personality disturbance. By 1968, that classification was updated to sexual deviation. And again, this reinforces what Carrie's saying is, as the science changes and societal perspectives change, we start to see this reflected in our diagnostic criteria. The DSM-3 in 1973 actually removed homosexuality based on the research, and it concluded that sexual orientation change was not possible, and that same-sex attraction was part of human sexuality. This was huge for the LGBT community in the United States at the time, to be recognized in this way in 1973. And then our most recent DSM-5 in 2018, sexual orientation was completely removed from the list of mental disorders. Gender identity disorder was later changed by, taken over by gender dysphoria, where it remains in its current state. We also want to include something about conversion therapy based on some questions that we've had from high school teachers. And this resource I loved, I put in the bottom corner. So this is a most recent study that was conducted in 2019 and looking at conversion therapy across the globe. But when we start thinking about the science and the research, back in 2019 in the United States, Ryan and their colleagues indicated that compared to peers reporting no or low levels of family rejection, LGB young people who reported high levels of family rejection were 8.4 times more likely to report attempting suicide, 5.9 times more likely to report serious depression, and 3.4 times more likely to report using illegal drugs and to engage in unsafe sex. So this reinforces the importance of acceptance of our young people to help protect them from societal norms that may cause harm to them. In addition, the United States Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration noted that interventions that are aimed at a fixed outcome, such as gender conformity or heterosexual orientation, including those aimed at changing gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation are coercive, can be harmful, and should not be part of behavioral health treatment. Soon thereafter, we had individuals, organizations such as the National Association of School Psychologists, National Association of School Social Workers, the Association of Counselors, of School Counselors, all put out statements against the use of conversion therapy based on the data that has been collected. And then indeed, research by Myers, for example, suggests that psychological distress among LGBTQ plus individuals, which is often identified as minority stress, results from prejudice and discrimination, not from inherent mental illness, which is really important for us to pay attention to. So in 2009, the American Psychological Association appointed a task force to conduct a systematic review of articles on sexual orientation change efforts. This task force noted that these approaches are causing harm, including things like depression, guilt, helplessness, shame, social withdrawal, suicidality, substance abuse, stress, disappointment, self-blame, decreased self-esteem and authenticity to others, increased self-hatred, hostility and blame towards parents, feelings of anger and betrayal, loss of friends and potential romantic partners, problems in sexual and emotional intimacy, sexual dysfunction, high-risk sexual behaviors, a feeling of being dehumanized and untrue to a sense of self, a loss of faith, and a sense of having wasted time and resources. So we can see how big the potential damage can be if somebody is actually participating in these types of therapies. So we wanted to shift for us to think about school climate. We really start talking to schools about how do we create an inclusive school climate for all students? And why would that benefit all students, including the LGBTQ plus individuals that we're talking about today? We love this quote by our National Association of School Psychologists. The US has no greater responsibility than safeguarding the well-being of our children. Ensuring safe schools and communities is paramount to this responsibility. And we know during this current pandemic, it's even more important for us to be thinking about the mental health and well-being of our teachers, students, and staff. In addition, it's important for us to recognize that it's the school's ethical and legal obligation to take proactive measures to ensure that all members of the school community have a right to participate without fear. We've identified some of those federal laws here, the No Child Left Behind Act, the Equal Protection Clause, and Title IX. And we thought it was important for us to talk a little bit about what we think about when we say school climate. I love this definition by the National School Climate Center that was actually updated in 2020 to include a couple different dimensions that are actually I included with an asterisk below. So we think about safety. And when we think about, we're gonna highlight for the LGBTQ plus community, what are those rules and norms that we're talking about? How are those students, how do they feel about their sense of physical security and their social emotional security? From a teaching and learning perspective, what are we doing to help support the learning around LGBTQ plus individuals? Where are they being seen within the curriculum? Or how are we talking about those individuals within the curriculum? Are we talking about those individuals in the curriculum? And then the idea of how we're approaching social and civic learning. When we think about interpersonal relationships, how are we talking about diversity? How are we respecting diversity? What are the social supports that are coming from adults to students? We're spending a lot more time talking about teacher-student relationships and that bi-directional interplay between adults and students in those climates. When we think about institutional environment, how connected are our students to the school? How connected are they to the school community? How engaged are they? You know, are our LGBTQ plus students participating in extracurricular activities? Do they feel like they can be included in those activities? Or do they feel excluded? What do the physical surroundings look like? How do they feel to those individuals? What are those, when we think about kind of what do the bathrooms look like? You know, how would a LGBTQ plus individual feel going into the bathrooms? Is that a safe place? We know for transgender individuals, bathrooms are often the #1 place where violence occurs against that population. So when we're thinking about our spaces for our youth, our students, what is that going to feel like for an individual going into those spaces? New that we've included has been this idea of social inclusion. So are they included in things beyond the curriculum? And what does that look like for our youth? Another new one is social media. So when kids are engaged with computers or laptops or iPads or any type of social media in the school building in particular, do they feel safe? You know, are they not being targeted by others when they are online? And what does that look like when they're participating in communities that we're creating for them to engage, particularly now with this new focus on virtual learning? And then parts for staff in particular, what does the leadership do? What does that look like? I was working in a school where on camera, the principal was caught ripping down all of the signs about gay-straight alliances after the school building was closed. That's going to be a place that's not potentially safe for our LGBTQ plus individuals when we think about leadership. And what are those professional relationships look like? Are they supportive for the adults? Are they supportive of adults who are LGBTQ plus? You know, what do those climates feel like for those individuals? And then when we start thinking again about our LGBTQ plus students, we want supportive educators. And how can you do that? I think one of the themes that Carrie and I have talked about throughout our presentation today is there's lots of little things that you can be doing in your classroom and throughout these particular communities to help set up an inclusive environment for our students. And if our students are able to identify supportive educators, from a research perspective, we see an improvement in their academic performance. We see their educational aspirations beyond high school, which is really important. They see an increased sense of feelings of safety. Their absenteeism goes down. Their psychological well-being goes up. And we also see them feel more connected to the school community. And if you look at some of the GLSEN reports that we have as a resource at the end, one supportive educator can have an impact on all of these for our LGBTQ plus students. And so again, just small things that we can do to say, hey, we're here to support you. Another place is how we respond to bullying. And when schools have what we consider comprehensive bullying or harassment policies, where we identify communities that may be at increased risk within our policies, we see an increase in the sense of safety for those individuals. And we know that staff and students benefit by those types of policies. And we have examples of policies of inclusive policies, if people are interested. An inclusive curriculum. So access to information about LGBTQ plus people. The history, and we'll talk about that towards the end of our presentation. Events that have a positive impact on our staff and students. As I mentioned, school policies, they're inclusive, they're equitable when we apply policies to to all of our school community. When we think about dress code, when we think of public displays of affection, how are we addressing that for all of our students? School dances, proms, what are some of the ways that we approach those? How inclusive are we with those policies? And we want to make sure that we do not discriminate against LGBTQ plus students in those written policies, and then the application of those policies. So often I'm brought in when people are applying these policies in a way that's not fair across all groups around dress code or around public displays of affection, particularly in high schools. And then we also know that if schools are able to have a gay straight alliance, or some schools might call them spectrum, they have different names that might help in different regions. So you don't bring so much attention to those groups. But if we have a group where LGBTQ plus students and their allies can come together and be supportive of each other, we know that it plays a key role in improving school climate for those students, as well as the entire student community. And there's lots of research to support that in middle school and high school. And then finally, staff training. So what are the professional development opportunities that people have to help them think about how to include LGBTQ plus issues in the curriculum? We spend a lot of time thinking about that, being in a state that we have potentially some challenges to that. And so how do we do that in ways that teachers and staff feel safe and supportive in their environments?
So now I will start talking about options for the classroom. We'll also emphasize making students, especially since we're talking to high school teachers, part of imagining what's possible in the classroom. And we'll briefly introduce you to the gender diversity module we're working on with APA for use in high school APA psychology courses, AP psychology courses, sorry. So as Dr. Vargas already kind of mentioned, creating a safe, inclusive classroom for LGBTQ plus students, or really all students, may feel like a task that requires a lot of specific expertise or training or experience, or how do I do this without a program? It may feel overwhelming. And one thing that we would really emphasize, and I would also say that this also comes from all of the research we've been doing around trauma and trauma-informed care, is that there are practical everyday things that you can do. And they may feel really small or really obvious, but we can't emphasize enough how these things can help build trust and relationships in the classroom. Just yesterday, I was listening to this interview with a teacher who had a video go viral about learning these different handshakes for every single one of his students. And the interviewer was like, oh, it just seems so obvious, but I can see how that would just make me feel really seen as an individual. So it's really just about seeing and affirming in non-judgmental ways. We also feel like it was really important to consider how the options we discussed might be more or less accessible to teachers and students, depending on what district you're in. I think someone in the chat sort of talked about already being in a more conservative district and some of the challenges that can come with that. So our goal was to make suggestions that are flexible and that provide choice to you and your students. And a lot of these suggestions will also reflect the areas just highlighted by Dr. Vargas when discussing ways to improve school climate for LGBTQ plus students. So the first one, displaying support. How can you visually signal to students, even before you open your mouth, that you are supportive or welcoming of diverse identities? Again, this is a very small act. It may seem like, well, of course, but it can make a huge difference. A sign demonstrating support for inclusivity and diversity in general, or a sign demonstrating support for LGBTQ plus students might just enable your students to be able to walk into your classroom and take a deep breath, or just relax a little bit. And just kind of being able to regulate your body and feel grounded just by the presence of a sign, I think could make a huge difference. And if you are able to put up a pride flag or a safe space flag that is rainbow oriented, we would encourage you to do that. However, we also recognize that teachers may be concerned about the response from their districts, or just may be in different places themselves. And I think that's okay. There are signs that encourage general inclusivity and openness that some might feel more comfortable hanging in their office. So this is one that the Center for School Safety designed. And then these are just two that I found. One of them was developed by a peer in my cohort. And also just to provide an example, I am a school psychology intern in Coweta County, which is about 45 minutes south of Atlanta, and it's conservative. It's quite conservative, and I wasn't quite sure what I would be able to do. So I'm going to hold this up. I hope people can see it, but I put a little pride sticker on the back of my phone because I figured they couldn't tell me to take a sticker off my phone. And I had a student walk up to me in the hallway and just say, "I like your sticker." And then that student later came out to me as trans and became one of my counseling students for the rest of the year. So I think, again, such a small thing, but can make a really big impact. I think teachers can also consider, and school psychologists, everybody in the school, can consider what language they use in the school and in the classroom and how inclusive and normalizing that language is. Skip ahead here. And this is just to make all students feel more welcome in the classroom and maybe more likely to feel comfortable sharing or disclosing their identity. Although at the same time, I would say that you can normalize and be as inclusive as all get out, and maybe that student just isn't there yet. And we don't want to push them, but we do want to give them the invitation or the space to be able to do that. And I think one really simple thing to do is just normalizing the sharing of pronouns. So like on their first slide, we have our pronouns listed. I put my pronouns in the Zoom specifically just to demonstrate that. You can introduce yourself by saying, "My name is Ms. Lorig and my pronouns are she, they, or she, hers," or whatever your pronouns might be. And then you could invite students to introduce themselves and also share their pronouns, but I would give them the option. So again, maybe not forcing students, but giving them that option, giving them that choice, giving them some room to share, and also normalizing the sharing of your own pronouns. In my school district, I'm not sure if I could get away with that. So I put them in my email signature. Yeah, or in your Zoom, or in your Google Meet, or whatever you're using for virtual interactions. And then it's very common in our culture to address groups of people according to the binary: ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, quiet down. It can feel like muscle memory to many of us, including me. But there are a lot of neutral options out there. Just addressing the class by saying, "Hey, everyone," "Hey, everybody," "Hey, folks." I'm from Wisconsin, so "use guys" or "you guys" is really common and isn't really limited by gender. You all, very popular in the South. I also think that you could have fun and get creative. When I taught a poetry class, I would address them by a new name every day. Hello, shipwreck crew. Hello, crabs. You know, like I would just kind of try to come up with fun things to call them. And I know in our elementary schools, a lot of our teachers have kind of a theme or an animal that describes their classroom. So they get to call everybody the flamingos or the lobsters. And that does a lot of that work for you. And then again, just when speaking generally about individuals, a very small and simple thing to do is to include they, them alongside him or her, she, and his. So a student can pick his or her book from the school library is a very common sentence that many students would probably hear. But it'd be more inclusive to say something like a student can pick his, her, or their book from the school library. Or you could just say a student can pick their book from the school library. And then finally, thinking about making language in the classroom more inclusive of gender and sexually diverse students can mean kind of actively reflecting on the ways we talk about and enforce gender roles, and gender stereotyping in the classroom. And Dr. Vargas and I had kind of a conversation about how, you know, this is still a work in progress for us too. Like, what assumptions are we making when we learn that someone is a nurse, but we're not sure what gender they are just based on their name alone, and we haven't seen a picture of them. When we're talking about jobs, what do we say about what makes someone good or not good at a job? And how is that related to gender potentially? When we talk about marriage in the classroom, do we automatically say husbands and wives, or do we say spouses? What can we do or say instead? And again, I also think thinking about this as a learning opportunity. How can we involve students in some of the questions that we ourselves have? Is there a time where you can stop and say, hey, wow, I'm thinking about this character in this book in a really kind of gender stereotyped way? Why do you think that is? What is in the language that's making me think that or feel that? Can there be opportunities to do that across subject areas? So even in looking at scientific research, what are the questions we have about who was included in the sample and who wasn't and why? Things like that. I'll move quickly through the last two. So I think this one's hard, but I do think it's really important. I think proactively creating a plan for when students use discriminatory language in the classroom. And that can mean making clear to students what consequences of using discriminatory language in the classroom will be and what examples of discriminatory language are. And it can also mean making sure that any policy that you have in the classroom, again, like Dr. Vargas said, is being applied equitably. Are you actually upholding what you say are the consequences for students who use discriminatory language? And again, I would also just say taking advantage of your colleagues. What have you tried? This student is saying this in the classroom. What's worked for you? What have you done? If you have supportive administrators, talking to them. And I also think like looking out for students, for both students when these incidents occur. How can this be a learning opportunity for the student who used discriminatory language? And how can we also make sure that the student who was discriminated against has emotional support, knows that you're looking out for them, knows that you care about how they feel as a result of what's happened. And then finally, I just think the importance of relationships just really can't be understated. The research tells us that one strong adult relationship can be the key to unlocking and nurturing a child's resiliency. We know that. So you can be that person to a student. It can make a huge difference in their lives. And you don't need to know everything about LGBTQ plus research or terminology, or know exactly what the right thing to do is in order to have a strong relationship with a student. You know, and that's not to say relationships are hard, relationships are messy, even with kids. But at the same time, just thinking about listening to them and being willing to try to do things to support and affirm them. Again, in building a relationship with any student means allowing them to be experts of their experience. And in the case of LGBTQ plus students, recognizing that a lot goes into their identity. LGBTQ plus students are also good students. There are students who like math. There are students who don't like math. They're athletes, they're musicians, they're dancers. They can come from different cultural and racial backgrounds. Their sexual and gender orientation or identity is just a part of who they are. And they may have different feelings about how big that is in their lives. And then since we're talking about high school students, are there opportunities to have students be part of the conversation about what classroom practices look like? And I would imagine that that can be really different across different settings in different districts. But I'll say one example that I've sort of talked about in some of my classrooms is like allowing students to share with me anonymously what might trigger them. And then having conversations with the students generally about what we feel comfortable reading and what we want to do. And that's not to say that the students dictated exactly what we read, but we tried to work on it collaboratively together to try to come up with something that created the least amount of harm and the most amount of learning in the classroom for everybody. And that can also just be as simple as allowing students to choose who they research, or providing options for people that they're researching that are also part of the LGBT plus community. And I'll talk really, really briefly just about, so one thing that we've talked about is curriculum and involving LGBTQ plus history and research in school curriculum. And so we've been developing this module with the APA and TOPS. And then this is just a little outline, a little introduction of what we're going to be talking about in these lesson plans for AP psychology high school teachers. We're going to have lesson 1 is going to be about gender exploration. Lesson 2 is going to be about gender as a biopsychosocial construct. And so that's going to be like separating those cultural ideas about gender and also merging them with psychological and scientific and medical research about gender, cultural and historical considerations about gender. So thinking about how gender has changed over time in Western society and how it looks in all kinds of different cultures. The importance of pronouns, and finally, lesson 5 sort of focuses on seeking support at school. What can schools offer? What does support look like in different schools? And so I think we're running short on time, so I will stop there.